So today we're going to start a new book. It is called Humphrey's Playful Puppy Problem. So we read a short version of Humphrey before his really, really race. So let's see what Humphrey gets into today. Chapter 1 is called Pet Project. It was Friday afternoon at Longfellow's school. I'm the class hamster in room 26. I was nibbling on a yummy carrot stick when I heard Mrs. Bisbane say, "Class, don't forget to bring in your science projects on Monday." That's kind of strange. Actually going into the school. That was such exciting news that I almost dropped my carrot. My classmates had been talking about their experiments all week. They sounded very interesting. Excuse me. I turned to Og, the other classroom pet. "Did you hear that, Og?" I said. "We're going to see all the science projects on Monday." "Boing, boing," Og replied. "He makes a funny sound, but he can't help it. He's a frog." "Would any of you like to tell us about your projects now?" Mrs. Bisbane asked. "I would." "Raise your hand," Heidi called out. "Heidi, what did you forget to do?" Mrs. Bisbane said. Heidi raised her hand. "Sorry," she said. "I'm testing different liquids to see how long it takes them to freeze." "Interesting," Mrs. Bisbane said. "So, what have you tried?" "Plain water, sugar water, salt water," Heidi said. AJ's hand shot up. "I don't get it," he said in his loud voice. "Why won't they just melt by the time you get to school?" "Lower your voice, AJ," Mrs. Bisbane replied. "All right," he said in a softer voice, "but won't they just melt?" "Yes," Heidi said. "So I'm taking pictures and keeping a chart. That's what I'm going to bring in." Just thinking about things that are cold, cold, cold made me begin to shiver, even though I have on a fur coat. "How about you, Cheyenne?" Mrs. Bisbane asked next. Speak Up Cheyenne didn't raise her hand because she doesn't really like to talk in class. Cheyenne smiled shyly. "I'm growing beans on a windowsill," she said. "Some will have full sun, some will be covered." Stop giggling. Gail was growing mold in her refrigerator. Mold. That sounded yucky, but Gail said that it was so much fun. Pay Attention Art talked about magnets, and Golden Miranda said something about making a rainbow. Then I noticed Richie Rinaldi waving his hand. Mrs. Bisbane asked him to speak. He said something like "sir hum." At least that's what I heard. "And hamsters having this good hearing." "Repeat it again, Richie," Mrs. Bisbane said. "And this time say it so I can actually understand." "It's my turn to take Humphrey home this weekend, right?" Richie asked. "Well, I need him for this experiment." I was so happy to hear that. Classroom pets like me love to be needed. "I thought your project was about ants," Mrs. Bisbane said. "Well, it was," Richie replied, "but my mom didn't like having ants in the house. Now I have a better idea using a hamster." Mrs. Bisbane checked her list. "Yes, Richie," she said. "It is your turn to take Humphrey home. Do you want to tell us about this new experiment?" "Yes, tell us," I shouted. Of course, all of my friends only heard squeak, squeak, squeak. Richie thought for a moment. "I think it should be a surprise." Kirk Chang raised his hand. "I know what it is," he said. "Richie's going to turn Humphrey into a monster." Then he raised his arm straight out in front of him and made this huge scary face. "And when he's a monster, He can have a ghoul friend, Kirk added. Everybody laughed. It was funny unless you were the hamster who was going to be turned into a monster. And I really didn't want to have a ghoul friend. Boing, 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 boing. Og sounded worried. After all, his tank was next to the cage on the table by the window. He probably didn't want to have a monster as a neighbor, but Richie had a big smile on his face. I was happy for him. I would have been even happier if I had known what the experiment was going to be. When we were on the school bus that afternoon, Richie told me, I have a surprise for you at home. The bus was bumpy and thumpy. I slid from one side of my cage to the other. Just you wait, Richie said. It's a giant surprise. I wonder what his surprise is going to be. A giant is something kind of like a monster. Did Richie really have a giant at home? Eek, I squeaked. Richie laughed. You'll find out soon enough. The surprise was named Poppy. Poppy? Well, Poppy was a puppy. She was small with curly black fur and she loved to bark. All that barking made my ears twitch and my whiskers wiggle. Isn't she just great, Humphrey? Richie asked. He set my cage on the desk in his room. I've wanted a dog for years and finally my parents let me have one. I didn't really think Poppy was all that great. I don't think that any dog is great. Dogs have large, pointed teeth and wet noses. They have big tails and sharp claws. And they aren't usually friendly to small creatures like me. Woof, Poppy barked. She tried to jump up to see me. Luckily, she was too short to get all that way up to my cage. She likes you, Humphrey, Richie laughed. She wants to be your friend. Woof, Poppy barked. She even wagged her tail. But I still didn't see that she wanted to be my friend. Wait until Uncle Otto comes over tomorrow, Richie says. He's going to help me with the experiment. Richie's Uncle Otto is our school custodian. At night, when he comes into room 26 to clean, he talks to Og and me. Sometimes he balances a broom on one finger and gives us treats. I was glad I would be seeing Otto the next day. I wasn't so glad about that experiment, though. After dinner, it was time to watch a movie. Richie put my cage on a shelf in the living room. Poppy couldn't jump up that high, so he didn't even try. She looked up at me and barked, 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 and barked some more. Woof, 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 woof. Richie's mom finally put the puppy in the kitchen so we could get started with the movie. It was about a mad scientist named Frankenstein who created a scary monster. He hooked him up to a scary machine. There was lightning and the monster came to life. He had a flat head and boats sticking out the side of his neck. The sight of him made my fur stand up on end. Richie came over to my cage. He made some weird faces at me, Humphrey Stein, in a creepy voice. Then he began to laugh. Wah ha 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 ha. He didn't sound like Richie at all. By the time Richie brought me into his room and went to bed, it had begun raining outside. Would there also be some lightning? I would end up with bolts in my neck like Dr. Frankenstein's monster? Oh my. Would people really call me Humphrey Stein? I crawled into my little sleeping house, but I didn't sleep a wink. I love, love, love being a hamster, but I would not love being a monster. We'll read chapter 2 tomorrow. I go for a spin.